All right, so I don't know how many of you know that we have an amazing group of people in our church that is dedicated to looking at our church archives. How many of you knew we had church archives? Okay, most of you, that's good. So we actually moved them from the basement to a second floor room in the Vincent building this past year so that they don't get ruined by moisture. And we have, 5 or so people who gather every week to spend some time looking through these. And Tim has been one of those people for a number of years. I hope you all know Tim, who has been, how long have you been a member of the church? 25 years or so, and also brings knowledge and approach of a historian to us. So we're really grateful that today he's going to help us look at our own history of Union Congregational Church through the lens of racial justice and ask, what is our story as it relates to this for our Easter offering? So I'm going to turn it over to Tim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Katrina. I should have you introduce me more often. Yes. In the spirit of our Easter offering focus on racial justice, as Katrina said, we thought it would be a good idea to explore our church's history of engaging with racial justice issues over the last 140 years. Several of us, as Katrina said, have been working in the archives for the past few years, most notably Catherine Spinella and Firth Fobin and Beth Pugh and Della Smith and a few others. And it's become clear that there are many stories waiting to be told. And this is one of them. We were also sparked by the Join the Movement initiative of the United Church of Christ, which encourages congregations to share their own stories related to social justice and racial justice, both the good and the not so good. And I'll only have time to touch on a few ways that we have worked as a church to address racial inequality and racial injustice over the decades. It's a much bigger story than I expected. And I'll pay more attention to the first 100 years than to the last 40 years. But perhaps this will be a start of a deeper dive and maybe a larger conversation. As Join the Movement points out, and it's on the slide up here, our stories show us not only who we are, but also inspire who we may become. And there's an echo to this microphone, which I hope isn't bothering the folks online, but we'll keep charging ahead. So let's get started. First, some background. As most of you know, Montclair separated from Bloomfield in 1868 and then experienced a period of rapid growth at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. The town's population grew in high double-digit rates, and then peaked at around 1930 at about 40,000 residents, where it's remained pretty much since. And as you can see in the lower left, where did it go? We're working on the volume here.
I just didn't want you to have the echo that you did.
As you can see in the lower left, that the Black population in Montclair was 12% by 1910, even before the Great Migration of Blacks from the south to the north around World War I. It's now about 23%. And these two maps, excerpts, one from 1906 and the other from 1933, tell the story. The wavy line in the middle of each map is Norwood Avenue, just up there. And as you can see, the larger sized estates were subdivided beginning around 1900 into smaller but still good-sized house lots, and the process was basically completed by World War II. Union Cong is the oldest church in Upper Montclair. Our founding members were among the first residents in the area to take advantage of the new Greenwood Lake line, the Boonton line up here, built in 1873, and many were successful business executives who moved from Brooklyn or elsewhere for cleaner air and a straightforward commute into Manhattan. The population of Upper Montclair in this early period was overwhelmingly white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, prototypically WASP. Union Cong membership, shown on the right side of the slide, grew even faster than the population of the town. And I think our membership peaked at somewhere around 2,100 members, a third of whom were non-resident, two-thirds resident, in the late 1950s, before the turbulent 60s started a decline. And as we'll see later, Upper Montclair remains overwhelmingly white, but it is nowhere near as Protestant as it was 100 or more years ago. One of the first things I did in preparing for this presentation was to run a keyword search in the digitized issues of the Montclair Times for the word colored and the word Negro. You find lots and lots of position wanted ads for chauffeurs and cooks and maids, and they nearly all indicate the color of the person looking for a job. I pasted in a sample in the upper right. Willing and obliging colored girl will make herself generally useful in private family, from 1920. You also find a number of references to James Sadler, who was the publisher of the Newark Herald, a black newspaper, who's one of the activists in this town that we can hope that James Howe House will look into further. I also watched a couple of videos on the Join the Movement website, including one about First Congregational Church in Washington, D.C., Mike Spinella's old church, that features Dr. Renee Harrison of Howard University. And I was really struck by her use of the phrase, benevolent white Christians. She wasn't being overtly critical. In fact, she had a lot of positive things to say, but she was telling it like it was, and perhaps like it is. And that made me wonder what would characterize benevolent white Christians, especially the leaders of Union Cong 100 years ago. And in listing these characteristics, you may be able to offer others. I'm holding up a mirror to the past, but of course they are also holding a mirror up to us at the same time. So on issues of racial justice, were early members of this church paternalistic? Absolutely. Were they acting from a position of privilege? Again, yes. I've circled in red some of the residences of early leaders in our church, the Dormans and the Bethels up there on Upper Mountain Avenue. Charles Anderson, who by this point had already given the land for Anderson Park, still owned a lot of land between North Mountain and Upper Mountain. They were wonderful people, truly dedicated church leaders in this church, but they also enjoyed remarkable privilege, especially in those pre-income tax days. For their day, were they progressive? For the most part, yes. For example, Sarah Bird, one of the founders of this church, went so far as to establish and run a settlement house in Lower Manhattan for immigrants, mostly Russian Jews. And we should do a second hour on her sometime, because she set a standard for service that very few in our church have matched since. And was the engagement of the members of this church with racial justice 130 years ago, was it episodic or was it sustained? And the answer is sustained. As we'll see, this church's support for black colleges was remarkably consistent, covering decades. Did they inhabit or even assume separate worlds for whites and blacks? Yes. And finally, who made the decisions about institutions and programs involving blacks? The answer, I think, goes back to paternalism. And as we'll see, our church members and other Congregationalists of the day could be slow to see decision-making leadership to blacks. So what did members of Union Cong do about perhaps the biggest issue of their day, Remember that Union Cong was founded 17 years after the end of the Civil War. Reconstruction had been implemented and then was in retreat. Jim Crow was beginning. And the answer is in the very first list of benevolent contributions in the upper right. That's what we would call today outreach, that this church made in 1883. Note the third item. American Missionary Association, $179, roughly equivalent to about $5,000 today. The photo in the lower right is George Gates, the first minister of this church. More on him in a bit. But what was the American Missionary Association? I'll admit that I had to look it up. It turns out that it was an abolitionist group founded by Congregationalists after the Amistad trial in New Haven in 1846, with a focus on the education of blacks. From the beginning, it had an integrated board, which was highly unusual in that period, to say the least. And their efforts really ramped up after the end of the Civil War, when they worked closely with the Freedmen's Bureau to start hundreds of primary and secondary schools, as well as a number of black colleges, now known as HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. I've listed some of them that the American Missionary Association either started or supported very early on. It's not a complete list. And I've highlighted Fisk University and Talladega University because this church had especially close relationships with them. It's also worth noting that Mrs. Charles G. Phillips, I found a photograph of her on Ancestry.com. I was curious to know what her name was because she is always listed as Mrs. Charles G. Phillips. And turned out she was Jenny Mae Daniels from Massachusetts. She was a longtime president of the Women's Missionary and Aid Society in this church, the precursor to the Women's Guild and today's women's group. And she became, I understand, the first woman to serve on a national board of our denomination when she was elected to the executive committee of the American Missionary Association in 1913. And she served for 10 years. Our church made annual donations to the American Missionary Association for 34 years, from 1883 to 1927. In the early days, benevolence was handled separately from the operating budget. There were separate commitments from members of the church and separate offerings, quarterly offerings. And one of the quarterly offerings was for the American Missionary Association. Union Cong members responded generously to these offerings. In April 1885, the American Missionary, which was a monthly publication related or put out by the American Missionary Association, included this note that I put on the slide. The Congregational Church of Upper Montclair, New Jersey, numbers only 42 members, but its annual contribution for the AMA, the American Missionary Association, taken a few weeks ago, was $233.75, or $5.56 a member. This per capita contribution was at least double the rate of most other churches at the time, and it's equal to about $170 today. In the years when Jim Crow was on the rise, the American Missionary Association consistently opposed the disenfranchisement of black men, challenged segregation laws in court, and vigorously condemned lynching. The AMA had its shortcomings, to be sure, but it never wavered from its position that blacks were equal in God's sight. It was also, for the time, a fundraising juggernaut. And around the turn of the 20th century, they must have had a special initiative asking individuals not just to contribute through their churches, but to take out individual life memberships, $30 life memberships, roughly equivalent to about $1,000 today. And at least 24 residents of Upper Montclair, and I've tried to map them to to members of this church, and the great majority, nearly all of them, were members of this church, including, you'll see on the left, is it 5 down? Yeah, Mrs. Charles G. Phillips. But also on the right, 3 down, and Beth, I'm glad you're here. Star King Pugh, Beth's great-grandfather, was one of those who took out a life membership in 1902. I don't know whether he was a member of this church. We're trying to figure it out because Beth tells me he was a founder of Watchung Congregational Church 2 years later. By the way, First Congregational Church in Montclair, if anything, was even a stronger supporter of the American Missionary Association than our church. After George Gates, the first minister, left Union Cong in 1887, he became president of Grinnell College in Iowa, and then moved to Pomona College in California. I assume that both were all-white institutions, but he was also president of Pomona. But he believed strongly enough in the education of blacks that he left Pomona to become the 3rd president of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Fisk University, like Howard and Talladega, focused on a strong liberal arts education. That was at issue in the day. Booker T. Washington and others were advocating more industrial training, such as Tuskegee Institute or Hampton Institute implemented. But W.E.B. Du Bois and others wanted to focus on a rigorous liberal arts education. And again, that's what Howard and Fisk and Talladega and others offered. Gates worked to improve the curriculum at Fisk University, but unfortunately, he was injured in some sort of accident involving the Pennsylvania Railroad, and died not long after. So he served Fisk as president for only 3 years or so. It took the trustees of Fisk another 35 years to 1947 to name a black as president of the university. As some of you may know, that was Charles S. Johnson, a sociologist, who happens also to be the grandfather of Jay Johnson, who many of us know from around Montclair or from his service as Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration. Concerts by the Jubilee Singers of Fisk University were one of the ways that the college raised money for operations and spread word about the work of the college. The Jubilee Singers were often hosted by congregational churches in different areas. Union Cong hosted the Jubilee Singers on at least 2 occasions. In 1919, the text at the top left is from the bulletin, from a bulletin must have been in May 1919. And then again in 1924, this is an article on the right from the Montclair Times about that visit. And this was the last stop for the Jubilee Singers before they left for a tour in England. And apparently the concert was involved a number of spirituals, but also recitations of poetry by Paul Laurence Dunbar. A poet from a black poet from that era. On other occasions, the Jubilee Singers appeared at the Glen Ridge Congregational Church, the Watchung Congregational Church, First Congregational Church, and a quintet of Jubilee Singers also came to Montclair in 1919 when the American Missionary Association held its annual meeting at First Congregational Church in Montclair, and the notice about that from the church bulletin is in the middle on the left. And by the way, the American Missionary Association refused to hold its annual meeting in any location where both blacks and whites could not be accommodated in the same hotels. One of the most remarkable and surprising items in Union Cong's archive is this letter from the Grand Dragon of District 1 of the Ku Klux Klan, warning Jay Stocking, our minister at the time before and after the First World War, to mind his own business, quote, regarding the Southern Negroes, and to immediately retract a statement concerning the Ku Klux Klan. The letter is undated, so we don't know when it was sent, and I've not yet found a statement by Stocking or anyone else associated with this church specifically regarding the KKK. Perhaps it's from the post-World War I era, when the KKK tried to establish a toehold in this area. They interrupted a youth meeting at the Italian Presbyterian Church. I think it was actually on Pine Street. I think I typed in Grove Street. I think that was a mistake. In 1921. And in 1925, someone placed a burning cross on the lawn of a Montclair black man who had been issued a license to marry a white woman. In 1924, Mr. Hinkey, you've all seen the name Hinkey Building down in Bloomfield and Church Street. Mr. Hinkey was the owner of the Claridge Theater at the time, and he scheduled a 3-day revival showing of the notoriously racist Birth of a Nation movie in 1924. And the city council of Montclair actually took steps to stop the showing of the movie. Newark also stopped the showing of Birth of a Nation in 1924. But the city council received a letter from a resident of Upper Montclair Avenue and a petition signed by 550 blacks in Newark. The petition had been organized by James Sadler, the publisher of the Newark Herald I mentioned earlier. And this may be unfair, but one gets the sense that the city council had one letter from a resident of Upper Montclair and a petition from 550 blacks in Montclair, and weighed them about equally in deciding to prevent the showing of the film. Or this letter from the Grand Dragon of the KKK may date from a few years earlier, because during the First World War, when Union Cong held a special offering for the American Missionary Association, Stocking noted in the lower right there, that's from a bulletin, church bulletin at the time, he noted that when we are seeking to make the world safe for democracy, we must see to it that our own country is safe for democracy. An explicit criticism of the South. But also note the cringeworthy paternalism, to say the least, in Stocking's statement. He says that making our country safe for democracy is in response to, quote, the call of our dependent peoples. That is what he called the colored people in the South. When George Clark Vincent, the Vincent Building is named after him, was minister of Union Cong for 34 years, from 1928 to 1952, the church organized regular forums at which nationally recognized speakers addressed key issues of the day. In our own day, Near to Mid is doing something similar, not to the extent that we did it in the 30s, but the same sort of thing. And I think Vincent likely took the lead in inviting Elaine Locke to speak at Union in 1930. Locke is considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and at the time he was a professor of philosophy at Howard University. And Vincent may have known Locke through the Rhodes Scholarship program. George Clark Vincent was a Rhodes Scholar in 1904, just the second or third year of the program. And Locke, who was a brilliant Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Harvard, was selected as a Rhodes Scholar in 1907. And he was the first Black Rhodes Scholar, and indeed the only one until 1963. Locke spoke on the topic, the Negro problem. Keep that phrase, the Negro problem, in mind. I suspect he was given that topic rather than chose it himself. But this article from the Montclair Times suggests that he turned it around and discussed the issue of how white America would deal with the Negro, and in particular, whether the suburbs would recognize the American Negro on an equal basis with his white neighbor. And specifically, in the lower left, it is up to the suburbs to decide whether they will accept New York City's liberalism or reject it. Silence on this question will be interpreted as conservatism. And this was one of the most remarkable things, at least to me. For 20 years, Union Cong underwrote the salary of the president of Talladega University in Alabama. Remember, Talladega at the time was, along with Fisk and Howard, was one of the HBCUs that really focused on a rigorous liberal arts education. We underwrote, if not the whole amount, certainly the major part, to the extent that starting in January 1924, this is the first mention that I've seen in a church bulletin, Jay Stocking, then the minister, listed Frederick Axel Sumner as one of our church, quote, representatives in mission fields, along with Dr. Frank Laubach, who was ordained in this church and who spent years, decades in the Philippines and elsewhere in Asia, advancing literacy with his each one, teach one approach. We should do a second hour on Laubach sometime too. Union Cong's support of Talladega College continued in the height of the Depression, when Buell Gallagher became president of Talladega, even as we added to the list of personal representatives in mission fields, missionaries in China, professors at the American University in Beirut, ministers in Harlan County, Kentucky, Everett's, Kentucky, and in Red Vale, Colorado, as well as, if you can read that, the Reverend Yancey Thompson, who conducted, quote, social work for delinquent colored youth here in Essex County. And I haven't been able to find any additional information about Yancey Thompson's work. And at the same time, it appears that we also supported in part, quote, the Mexican work of the Spanish Congregational Church in El Paso, Texas. And we did this by lump sum contributions to national denominational boards. I haven't done it year by year, but probably the height was 1928 when this church contributed in total benevolences the equivalent of around $450,000, which is 3 times what we do now, and they didn't have an endowment or Christian mission fund in those years. In November 1933, Union Cong celebrated Talladega Day, and both Frederick Sumner, the retiring president of Talladega, and Buell Gallagher, the incoming president of the college, spent the day here at Union Cong. And George Clark Vincent introduced Buell Gallagher to the congregation, quote, as a man known for more radical views on the social problems of our country, and therefore peculiarly suited to the new problems arising in the field of race relations. Gallagher was only 29 years old when he was named president of Talladega. He had served briefly as minister of the Congregational Church in Passaic, New Jersey, after attending Union Theological Seminary and the London School of Economics. And one of the stipulations of his being named president of Talladega was that he complete his doctoral work at Columbia University, and more on that in a bit. I suspect that Dr. Vincent had met Gallagher when he served the church in Passaic and admired both his intelligence and his fierce commitment to interracial work. Now, I didn't know a thing about Buell Gallagher before starting on this talk. He does not appear in either our 75th or 100th anniversary church histories. And indeed, all the decades of support for Talladega gets one line in the church histories. And I must admit, I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole learning more about him. When he was 27, Gallagher wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois seeking advice on where he might best pursue interracial work. And Du Bois responded with the letter. Du Bois's retained copy is on the left there, and I don't know if you can read that. I'm not sure I can read it now. But his advice was bracing. In the second paragraph, I imagine, however, Du Bois wrote, that most of the real interracial work is going to be done in the future outside of organizations, especially designed for such work. I should think, for instance, that a man with a church in a small town who could bring into that church white and black, natives and foreigners, employers and employees, would in the end be doing an interracial job far beyond any organization. I regret to say, however, with the present attitude of white Christians, I do not anticipate that the young man would find such a job easy. Well, Gallagher would later attempt something very much along the lines suggested by Du Bois, but first he served as president of Talladega College for 10 years, mostly during the Depression. Gallagher returned to Union Cong on at least a couple occasions when the church celebrated its annual Talladega Day, including in 1936 when he spoke about Negro Americans in modern society. And I suspect Gallagher was trying to bring church members along when he argued for an emphasis on justice, brotherhood, and sharing instead of pity and paternalism in providing support in response to appeals for Black colleges and universities. In 1939, when Dr. William Pickens spoke here, Pickens was a Talladega graduate, a Phi Beta Kappa student at Yale, and an officer of the NAACP. Our church invited, quote, all friends of the college and Negro education to be present. And in 1940, when Buell Gallagher returned for what was called Race Relations Sunday, keep that phrase in mind, the church organized a program with Gallagher, quote, for young people of high school age, including Negro groups. Union Cong continued its direct support for Talladega until 1972, a span of almost 5 decades. I've gotten so interested in Buell Gallagher that I've purchased copies of his American Cast in the Union and the Negro College, published in 1938 by Columbia University Press. His essay on the American caste system, published in the Social Action, which was a publication of the Council for Social Action by Congregational Christian Churches, and that was in 1941. And his rather hard-hitting Color and Conscience, the irrepressible conflict from that was published in 1946 by Harper and Brothers. And you're welcome to look at my copies if you're interested afterwards. Keep in mind that that Union Cong still counted Gallagher as one of our representatives in mission fields when the first 2 items were published. And I'm not sure how many members understood his views, but I have little doubt that George Clark Vincent did, and I wonder if he had to run interference on occasion. In his 1938 book, which is kind of a sociological study, Gallagher examined racial justice issues at length by analyzing the intersection of race and class in American society, particularly in the South. And he challenged white America to reach the point where, quote, the Negro will find that the old alternative of mutiny or subservience is replaced by the possibility of citizenship. And he addressed churches more directly in this booklet, in his 1941 essay, finding an appalling apathy of Christians in the face of the clear challenge of caste. I was going to read some of that up there, but I don't have the right angle. Maybe I can do it this way. You know, he knows that the churches are not altogether silent. Some are studying race relations. And behind them in the procession are other churches where there is a concern over what they call the Negro problem. Several denominations have passed resolutions in their national gatherings, which, if translated into action, would sweep the institution of caste off the American scene in a decade. But resolutions merely resolve. And on the whole, there is an appalling apathy of the Christians of America in the face of the clear challenge of caste. And then he asked, what are the churches to do? And in this Color and Conscience, he challenges what he calls the delusion of white superiority, noting that slavery as ownership of chattel is gone, but as a caste system, it remains. Well, after he resigned from Talladega in 1943, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote to Gallagher, "I have learned with your resignation with deep distress. You have done a fine job for the American Negro, but that kind of courage costs a great deal today." And unfortunately, it would take another 11 years before the trustees of Talladega named a Black as president. Gallagher went out to California, became a professor of Christian ethics at Pacific School of Religion, and he helped to start an intentionally interracial church in Berkeley, California, with co-pastors, one Black and one white. And later he served as president of the City College of New York system for 17 years. I want to jump now to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and note Mark Bailey's central role in communicating Christian social action and racial justice issues to local churches around the country. Mart was editor of the United Church Herald in these years. And he formed a close friendship with Andrew Young, the United Church of Christ minister, colleague of Martin Luther King Jr., and then later the U.S. representative to the United Nations. And these two photos on the left and the right are from Mart's archives. On the left, Andrew Young is meeting with high school students in Indiana in 1962. It was a gathering of high school students in the local church Pilgrim Fellowship or Youth Fellowship. And the photo on the right shows Mart with Andrew Young in Montclair in 1976. And I had hoped to put up 3 posters with copies blown up of three of Mart's articles, but FedEx messed up the delivery. They were supposed to get here on Wednesday. I'm going to get them tomorrow. But Katrina and Kim, I hope we can figure out a way to put up these 3 posters with Mart's articles that was selected with Allison Rogers' help. The first is Mart's report on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This is the march, of course, when Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. But Mart's article puts it in a larger context. The second article, which I hope you look at next week, is his report on a lobbying effort by various United Church of Christ churches in Washington, and lobbying efforts sponsored by the Council for Social Action, for Christian Social Action, and the Council for Racial Justice Now. And the third article that we'll have up with luck is Who Will Be Next? This is quite a moving essay that Mart wrote after the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, and noted the succession of assassinations that had occurred. I grew up in a household where the United Church Herald was one of the magazines on our coffee table. And I don't recall specifically reading these 3 articles, but I probably read this one. I was 17 years old at the time. And at the very least, my own personal views on racial justice as a teenager were no doubt shaped by the reporting and editorial work of Mart Bailey. It was important and influential work, and Mart, thank you. Union Cong was involved for about 15 years, from 1955 to 1971, with the East Harlem Protestant Parish. This was an effort to put social action to work in the inner city. Ministers and seminarians from Union Theological Seminary lived in the East Harlem community, and they worked from rented storefronts, and they tried to meet the needs of residents for things like health care, heat for their apartments, and summer camps. They provided advice on organizing marches, protests, petitions, union strikes. Union provided an annual contribution during this 16-year period. And one of our members, John Ricker, served on the board of the East Harlem Protestant Parish for several years and was deeply committed to the work. He later served as president of the Montclair Fair Housing Committee. Tom Pugh was also deeply involved, Beth's father, and Beth tells me that she remembers that hers was one of the 4 families who hosted a teenager from East Harlem for 2 weeks in 1965. The Women's Guild hosted at least 3 programs with speakers and residents from the East Harlem Protestant Parish in 1962, 1965, and 1969. And we were by no means alone in this effort to support the East Harlem Protestant Parish, support from churches in the metropolitan area, but also in Montclair. Others involved were Central Presbyterian, Grace Presbyterian, Watchung Congregational, and the Unitarians. Over the last 40 or 50 years, and I'm just going to skim right past this, but in interest of time, we've continued to engage with racial justice, both through outreach efforts and conversations and programs. We supported the Metropolitan Ecumenical Ministry in Newark, and of course our tutoring effort for nearly 40 years with the Sussex Avenue School in Newark took place here in this building. Roxanne Kent and Bob Chase brought Uniform Justice to us in 2017, and I count Side Door, which we've now been running for 20 years, as both a racial and social justice effort. In 1973-74, we had a task force on racial justice, which evolved into a community involvement task force. We've engaged in various conversations on race. I remember ones with Union Baptist Church. We had a 4-part series on white privilege in 2017. Katrina took the youth to Memphis and Montgomery in 2019. Jen Hand and Sohee Ko led a racial justice task force in 2020. But to conclude, I want to go back to my earlier slide and ask if we've been able to move beyond being benevolent white Christians. And I will suggest some answers to that, but it might be a topic for conversation, and you may come up with different answers than I do. I think we have learned to be less paternalistic than folks were in this church 100 years ago, although it still lurks in both the foreground and background. We still act from a position of relative privilege, even if we are not nearly so financially privileged as the early leaders of this church were. We're still a progressive congregation, but of course the definition of progressive has shifted with the times. We're still engaged with issues of racial justice, both episodic and sustained. The separate spaces one is more challenging. The schools for our kids who go through the Montclair schools, that's the public schools at least, that's an interracial environment. Our workplaces tend to be interracial, but we mostly live in worship in separate worlds. Perhaps the most hopeful sign, at least anecdotally, is the increase in interracial households. But our location remains a big issue for us. There was discussion at the last Leadership Council, I understand, about are we an Upper Montclair church or are we more of a regional church? To address racial justice, we may need to think more as a regional church. The census map on the right, on this slide on the right, shows the ethnicity of the Upper Montclair census tract on a block-by-block basis. The white splotches in that map are parks and cemeteries where nobody lives. Those are the zero. Otherwise, there are only 3 areas that are less than 60% white in the Upper Montclair tract. And that includes Blacks, Hispanics, Asian families, as well as families with mixed racial and ethnic backgrounds. About half the blocks are at least 80% white, and apparently, if you look at the very top there, that black bar at 100%, there's more than one block that is 100% white. And finally, perhaps one of our biggest challenges remains who makes the decisions. The American Missionary Association and the boards of Black colleges were slow to name Blacks as presidents. When I served on the board of Metropolitan Ecumenical Ministry in the 1980s, I was then a member of St. Stephen's United Church of Christ in Newark. I recall only one Black member of that board. I think the board of the East Harlem Protestant Parish was largely white. And few of the organizations that we support in outreach today are led by people of color. CUMAC has been the most notable exception. As I said at the start, this year's Easter offering is focused on racial justice, and Katrina has been conveying that message as well. We will support both the James Howe House and the United Church of Christ Join the Movement initiative. The Howe House is located almost at the geographical center of Montclair. And as we learned at the Women's Breakfast last month, it's perhaps the oldest house that survives with an association with a formerly enslaved person. And the current initiative shows great promise by putting the experience of Blacks in our town at the center of its mission. It's an interracial effort, but it is led by Blacks. And we need more of that. And Join the Movement toward racial justice asks us to tackle our own stories, not just who we've been and who we are, but also what we may become. We made a start here this morning, but there is a lot more that we can do. Stories break down barriers. They can bring people together from different places. We can learn from them, and we can imagine a different future. May it be so. Thank you.